There is the story of a king in ancient times. He conquered a new foreign land and took as one of his captives a beautiful maiden. She was so beautiful, he made her his queen. One day, the new queen received a message from her home country that many of the people were being persecuted and some killed. A wise man who advised her suggested that possibly she had been placed in the role of queen for just the chance to save her people. And so she decided to do just that. The queen had to struggle with the question that you and I face every day when we need to persuade. The question is, by what means do we persuade? Do we use any and all means to persuade? Does the end justify the means, or do we have a personal sense of ethics that will guide our choices? This video is focused on the ethical considerations involved with persuasion. We have said that communication is the creation and sharing of meaning, and persuasion is the application of intent or motive to the communication process. Let's spend some time examining intent and motives. In other words, ethics. To do this, we'll examine the importance of ethics, suggest a definition of ethics, and explore different sources people choose for their ethics. Ethics are important. You might not have to save a nation of people, and maybe you're just using persuasion to convince your employer that you deserve a raise, or you're trying to convince your spouse to take that cruise you've been dreaming of. Whatever or whenever you persuade someone else of something, you should be thinking of the ethics of persuasion. Some might say that to have to stop and consider ethics in our daily use of persuasion is to suggest we slow down our persuasive communication to a snail's pace while we overanalyze the entire process. I would propose that it's important to consider ethics in persuasion just as it is to consider traffic laws when we drive. What happens when driving your car and you decide thinking about all those crazy traffic laws is unnecessary? Well, what can happen is chaos and accidents and people getting hurt even though you had good intentions. When we persuade others without thought to our ethics, it may work out, or people could get hurt in many ways. Let's stop and define what we mean when we use the word ethics. The textbook, Persuasion in Your Life, by Wall and Morris says, ethics is a system of accepted principles that make up an individual's or group's values and judgments as to what's right and wrong. They go on to say that to understand ethics, you must first be able to distinguish or decide for yourself what is good or bad, right or wrong. Second, you must be able to make a conscious choice to act on that decision of morality. Life, someone said, must be lived on purpose, and this is essentially what ethics are. If you are ethical, you have purposefully considered what you consider right and wrong, and you've decided to try to live within that moral construct. Does everyone have ethics? I would say yes, except for those who are suffering from a mental condition that prevents them from truly making moral choices. Some people have not examined the question of right and wrong with much consideration, or if they have, they find it easy to ignore. And others may focus on a variety of different sources or perspectives of ethics. It may not be the same source of ethics that you focus on. Let's explore 5 different sources of ethics. We will identify these sources as perspectives. Some people make ethical decisions about how to persuade based on a spiritual perspective. Some might call this a religious perspective, but using the word religion can carry many connotations. I will call it a spiritual perspective to focus on the ethical consideration of a person's understanding of the nature of God, a higher power, or other spiritual understanding. Many people seek out a greater understanding of the nature of life, the meaning of life, and a truth outside of ourselves. In doing so, they seek a guide for decisions of what is right and wrong morally. When using the spiritual perspective, the ethical context focuses on our understanding of spiritual truth, or a truth outside of ourselves. You would ask yourself, do my motives align with my spiritual morals? Some people make ethical decisions about how to persuade based on the human nature perspective. This perspective would emphasize there are unique characteristics that make us human or distinguish us from lower forms of life. Some of these characteristics would be our ability for rational thought, our ability to use words as symbols, and our ability to make value or moral judgments. When using the human nature perspective, the ethical context is asking if the persuasive appeal will elevate others or dehumanize and harm others. Some people make ethical decisions about how to persuade based on the situational perspective. The focus of the situational perspective is that the situation should play a strong role in deciding if an action taken by a persuader or a motive of the persuader is ethical. The strong consideration would be whether the end justifies the means of persuasion. It is an easy task to convince yourself that using a tactic you might not usually employ is justifiable, or that lying or misleading or slightly bending the truth is important in this situation. When using the situational perspective, the ethical choice becomes a choice of expediency and a choice of placing your own needs above the needs of others. Some people make ethical decisions about how to persuade based on the legal perspective. Society or government establishes legal perspectives on what is right or wrong, legal or illegal. This perspective examines the action instead of the motive, and yet the motive for an action can determine the extent of punishment for an illegal action. It's important to know and consider the legal perspectives of your ethical choices. While you may or may not have strong spiritual or religious ethics, remembering the legal perspective when making choices about how you're going to persuade others is wise. When using the legal perspective, the ethical context of whether the laws of society say an action is illegal or legal is the important thing. Some people make ethical decisions on how to persuade based on the dialogical perspective. Communication and persuasion is never a monologue occurring just between one person. It occurs in the context of a dialogue, two people. It means that you are attempting to persuade someone else or another person or persons in that dialogue. The dialogical perspective contends that we should consider the other person in that communication event. What are their needs, or in what way does my persuasive appeal bring a positive result or outcome to the other person? When using the dialogical perspective, the ethical context is asking if the persuasion is intended to only enrich you, or are you bringing an audience-centered solution when you're attempting to persuade the other person? So what is the bottom line as we discuss ethical considerations involved in persuasion? The bottom line is taking responsibility for your ethics. We all have ethics, what is understood as right and wrong, good or bad, and how we make those choices. That is, unless you're a true sociopath. You might emphasize a spiritual perspective, a human nature perspective, a legal perspective, or a dialogical perspective in your life. Or you might, as we all often do, combine these when making ethical choices. By the way, I would hope you do more than just hold a situational perspective. Although this is a perspective many hold of viewing ethics as a decision whether the end justifies the means in this situation. As I said, take responsibility for your ethics. And when you're going to attempt to persuade someone, pause and take stock of the ethics behind your motives and your intent. There are many ways to persuade others, and we will in upcoming videos examine these. But we must first ask ourselves if we have our hearts in the right place. Have we examined and chosen our ethics? We may not have to persuade a king in order to save the lives of thousands of people. Or maybe you might. But just like the queen, you have to make a choice every day about the methods and means you will use to persuade others. That is what the ethical considerations of persuasion is all about. See you in the next video.